Welcome to the Tech Arena Great Debate Series. The Great Debates are an opportunity to hear directly from technologists across the industry on the topics that are on the top of everybody's minds. And today's topic is one that I have been writing about and thinking about all year. It's enterprise adoption of AI, hyper hope. And to explore this topic with me, I've invited three leading technologists from across the industry to help. The first technologist is Ido Kadim with NeuReality. Welcome, Ido.
Allison, great to be here.
Second technologist is Lynn Comp from Intel.
Hey, Allison. This is going to be a really fun debate.
And batting cleanup is Steen Graham from Metrum AI. Hey, Steen.
Thanks, Allison. Thrilled to be here, especially with yourself, Ido, and Lynn. It's going to be a great conversation.
So, team, why don't we just start with an introductory topic, which is something easy for you. How do you see the AI landscape heading into the second half of the decade? And while you're answering, please give some flavor of your role at your company and the role that your company is serving when it comes to AI. Why don't we start with you, Steen?
Thanks for the opportunity to go first. Well, CEO and co-founder of Metrum AI, and we have two critical offerings in the AI space. One is a real-world performance benchmarking software platform that tests all the latest, greatest chips for AI, as well as the latest, greatest workloads in AI, so all the modern workloads. And then that really informs our enterprise product, where we have unique capabilities around voice, vision, or video, and of course text, but also have really cool agentic workflows and know your AI or quality AI testing elements. And so, back to your question, over the next 5 years, the back end of the decade, wow, the pace of change has accelerated so much. And I think that next 5 years, I think we've really kind of hit the multimodal threshold in a defined kind of spatial arena that is the computer or humans going to this computing interface. And so I think the new modalities that we'll get into is really the kind of the modality of robotics or physical world AI. And I think, using kind of all the modern intelligence that we have in modern neural networks and then deploying them with physical elements is really going to be a game changer for humanity. And everybody likes to joke about how, really, I want to write my own poetry, but I'd like the AI to do my laundry. I think, getting on the cusp of where the AI can take over those manual tasks, especially those dangerous and dirty and dull tasks that we all talk about, is, I think, hugely transformative. So I think that's a big change that I see on the horizon. And I think on the back half, I think what we have to address in that time period is just super high fidelity AI, completely eliminating hallucinations, and eliminating, at least for that computer modality of AI that we see today, eliminating any kind of excursion risk for ethical changes or excursions of the AI to operate independently. So I feel like as humans, I think we'll be very good at that excursion risk, ethically and otherwise, as well. So those are kind of the two key thoughts that I have. But man, change is happening so fast. It's a tough question to answer.
Hey, Lynn, I know that you've worked with many of the largest players in the AI landscape in your career at Intel, and you recently took on a new role associated with AI. Can you give your perspective on the topic and then also talk about what you're seeing from an Intel perspective in terms of this enterprise growth?
It's a really interesting phase in the industry. Some of the partners that I worked with in a couple of my sales roles used to talk about how AI right now is not, they like to say AI end to end, and the reality is it's end or end. So there's the frontier models, and then there's the things that are happening with some of the GPT generative AI copilot calculus. The question is really like, what's in the middle? So you've got knowledge workers who are trying to work with things. You've got some of the industrial military applications, and just YouTube, some of the drone or game engine applications. in some war fronts that are happening right now. And then you've got the frontier models, which is sucking up all of the investment right now from other startups who are trying to solve daily problems that they're having. So it's a really interesting shift of very clear applications on two polarities, what is happening in between, and then how enterprises ramping up on it. And just like one key example, as I've been coming into this head of AI sales for Intel role, looking at what we're training on versus what we actually have access to use in terms of tools, it's not all there yet. So there's some things that still have to get filled in the middle.
Now, Ido, you are sitting in a very interesting seat at NeuReality, a company that is designing accelerators specifically for specific functions of that AI pipeline. You're talking to a lot of folks across the industry. What are you seeing in terms of this trend, and what else would you like to add beyond what Steen and Lynn have talked about?
Yeah, so maybe a word first about NeuReality. We're building infrastructure to optimize AI inference and partnering with any accelerators that people think of, GPUs or ASICs, etc. So it's more of a like traditional data center enterprise play in a way. I think that kind of combining the comments from from Steen and Lynn, I think, and to your question, I would call it hype and hope, in the sense that the technology advancement is rushing at a pace that, the cliche, which I agree with and I experience, is unprecedented. But then it does hit in the enterprise sense against the kind of usual issues about how does it integrate into my environment? What is good for consumer? How do I turn it into good for enterprise? How does it integrate into processes and people? And people don't like for their jobs to go away. So I think there's a sort of tension between the people element and the technology element. And it will be fascinating to see how that evolves. I anticipate that from an enterprise perspective, and I'm focusing less on edge in my day-to-day. I think Steen is more of has a better perspective on how that would be adopted. But I think in sort of the core of enterprise, I see AI being integrated as a feature and in a lot of the existing platforms, Salesforce, Atlassian, SAP. They will all find ways to integrate AI into those platforms and create benefits of single pane of glass to data and really broad reach and analytics across tools within their purviews. And then how enterprises themselves develop their own products, I think, or their own tools internally. I think that is going to be a slower process of adoption and learning how to integrate these new things. A lot like, if people remember consumerization of IT a decade-ish ago. I think this is a new round of that.
So this is not the great kumbaya team. We need to find some debate. So I'm going to get a little bit more granular with you. We see forecasts of hockey stick growth starting in 2025 for generative AI adoption in the enterprise. Why will this happen? We'll start with you, Lynn.
I think that it reminds me a lot of years ago when IT would say, I need a big data. I'm going to install a Hadoop. I have one. It doesn't necessarily mean that their data, their processes, and everything else are ready to use it. There's this huge rush of, I have dollars to spend. And I was literally on the phone with a regional leader this morning who said that one of their customers said, I need 500,000 GPUs. Why do you need 500,000 GPUs? And the comment was, well, this is my budget and I've calculated down how much each GPU costs. So therefore, I'm going to buy 500,000 GPUs. And the question is really, and then what are you going to do? So I think the hockey stick is very dependent on whether you're talking build, design, install, or are you talking about consumption and people actually know what to do? They have the integration into the software applications that Ido mentioned. If you ask any enterprise user, even with dedicated standalone IT, the accessibility to those tools, very spotty. So again, I think what you're measuring has a lot to do with it. And to sound somewhat cynical, what you're selling, you know, life is pain. Anybody who says something otherwise is selling something. There's a lot of people who are selling a lot of things.
You've been shaking your head and look like you want to come in with an idea. Go right ahead.
Well, I think I would start with FOMO. Um, how can you not want to deploy AI if you're running a company? The promise is incredible. There are lots of examples out there of people who are using it. So I think the why is, to me, obvious. The promise of the technology is incredible. I was nodding my head because I tend to agree with Lynn that there is and sorry, I'm ruining your debate here, Allison, but I tend to agree with Lynn that it comes against what is the specific business problem I'm solving? Is this the right or best way to solve the business problem? What are the actual challenges of building, not just building the model or integrating a model, but what is the overall integration of the life cycle of this technology? What happens the day after I deploy? How do I maintain and operate it? How do I refresh it? I think there will be growing adoption of API-based cloud technologies, and it will take longer time to translate to infrastructure deployments because it'll take time for individual companies to learn how to optimize. I still think it's inevitable because I think, to Steen's comment about hallucinations earlier, it is much easier to control, maintain, and constrain a model that you own. It is much easier to deal with the security and compliance issues with a model that you own. But if it's a 500 million parameter model, it is very hard to deploy practically. And therefore, I would anticipate that many enterprises, and many enterprises are actively experimenting with medium and small models for their use cases. And I would anticipate that that would be a growing sort of owned deployment on-prem, not on-prem, doesn't matter.
I think one thing that we haven't really brought up yet is the data problem. Every single advancement in a technology has a data movement problem. And this is a huge model trained on relatively small amounts of data. And so, like, how do you get past that? I mean, data hygiene has not been great with enterprises for the last 15 years. So how do you navigate through that?
That's a really good question. Steen, you and your team at Metrum are working with enterprises on the ground floor across industries, getting them up and running with AI. With everything that Ido and Lynn have said, what would you like to add to this question?
Yeah, I think this was alluded to, but I think one of the things that I worry about, on behalf of enterprises, we can talk about adoption of AI, but that's very generic. And we talked a little bit about, hey, maybe there's these cloud prevalent APIs or these companies that have huge market positioning and already have data, already have access to tremendous amounts of data, maybe even some other companies' data through licensing or otherwise. But what I really worry about for enterprises is, what do they look like in 10 years if they adopt those native APIs? Does every company, in a certain industry answer the question the same way? And there's a lot of verticalization efforts, but if you adopt those off-the-shelf vertical tools for your industry, or if you adopt that cloud-based off-the-shelf platform, what is your company's sustainable differentiator going to be? And Metrum, we really try to focus on leaders that think that their IP is a differentiator, that think that their workflows are a differentiator, that think that their people, are differentiators. Now, the challenge with that as it pertains to people that want to go above and beyond and ensure that their companies have sustainable differentiation, then off the shelf tools, then leadership platforms, leadership companies, is then it becomes a lot of hard work. It becomes, the things that my, panelists talked about earlier, thinking about small language models and the affordability of that, to Len's point earlier, thinking about transitioning your data to make sure it's, in the right format for AI to be trained, or just organizing the right way. All these things are really, really hard work, to position for that sustainable success for companies. But I think leaders really have to look back and go, okay, if I choose the easy path, which is fast AI adoption, and maybe even the consumerization, like we talked about earlier, consumerization of IT type use case, what does my company look like from a valuation standpoint in 5 or 10 years? And I think that's the real trade-off. And I think people should think really hard about doing the hard work. If they truly believe their company has unique IP, unique data, and unique workflows, I think you should really think through this. And that, if more companies do that, that might slow adoption in a mathematical sense of adoption, but I think it'll lead to more enterprise value and more delighted customers for those companies that do that as well.
I guess one question that I have for you, since we all have this continued hope thread through everything that we're talking about, is there one thing that could crater this in enterprise in 2025? If you think about what could happen, what would it be that would halt or ridiculously slow adoption curves?
I think one thing that could happen, if you want to think bad scenarios, a catastrophic security event, right? Or a catastrophic business event as a result of hallucination, or one of these things that happen. Let's remember when people deploy native APIs, they're getting access to a very general purpose thing that was typically trained on all the data in the universe, sort of, right? You're paying for a lot of stuff that you don't need is one side of it, but you also are in this black box that has endless opportunities to do all sorts of things. And the deep understanding of how it does it is not always clear. So I think a catastrophic event like that could crater the whole thing. But otherwise, non-catastrophic, I think it's called the hype curve, the trough of disillusionment. Finding out that it's not as easy, or finding out that what works as a consumer and the accuracy levels that you get as a consumer, which are great, and mistakes are acceptable, that it simply doesn't work in the business environment, and it causes increased delays.
I think one of the biggest issues that I see potentially getting in the way is that there's this hope that that's a miracle, rather than recognizing, for example, how many standard off-the-shelf cookie cutter Salesforce deployments are there in big enterprises? 0. The process workflows are all very tuned to the business, how the company culture works, everything. And so if leaders are coming in and getting sold, you have to have an AI strategy, you have to have AI, and then assuming you can flip it over to Salesforce with an AI agent generically, as opposed to the people who did the Salesforce tuning for that specific flow, for that specific business type. I think it's over exuberance, and then realizing that this is something you fold in to your processes that you are training. You are training it just like you were training a new employee for the first period of time. So that lack of understanding, you have to actually make this something that works for you, just like Salesforce had to be made for you, just like Snowflake had to be tuned for you, just like, it was, name all the properties. It's not a horizontal one and done play. And I think that is the potential fallacy that people go into.
Steen, do you want to add anything here?
I mean, it's a great question because I was thinking through my mind of like what's already occurred, right? For enterprise and industry adoption. And using the off-the-shelf kind of tools, we've already seen attorneys get disbarred. And you think, well, that's very concerning. And think about all these people that work incredibly hard for all of their domain specific certifications across their industries. So certainly if you see an increase in certifications being revoked based on practices, I think that'll make people think twice. But it hasn't yet. I mean, and there's always that outlier example. Second is IP linkage. And again, this is kind of the off-the-shelf tools. We've seen companies have IP leakage already, material impactful IP leakage. And a lot of that's been buttoned up. So there's some optimism there. But I think the IP leakage pieces should be concerning as well. But it hasn't slowed things down. So what's short of catastrophic, which I think we already well covered. I think if you see enterprise AI operating autonomously and independently as we start deploying some of these agentic solutions, and you start seeing security and behavioral risks inside enterprises, and we can kind of unlock some of that, and really see that in enterprises. I think that'll be maybe something that it would be the next wave of hesitation would overcome, and then we'd have to work controls around that. This is all stuff that's controllable as well, but the press could come out and say, hey, our internal AI is now doing malicious things, and it's causing security gaps, or it's causing behavioral gaps, or misutilizing our resources. That might slow down enterprises a bit, but I think it's really catastrophic at this point. And I mean, I'm sure everybody's seen like how if you put a couple of AIs together, it just kind of the off-the-shelf chatbots, how they behave. And I think a good summary would be it's particularly degenerate behavior at times, and not something that any enterprise would be proud of. And so I think like in those types of scenarios, I think enterprise decision makers will think about deploying AI as they see preponderance of those scenarios. But to be fair, those scenarios have already occurred. So it's really that catastrophic event, I think, is the corner case.
And I have to say also, I don't talk to many naive enterprise technology IT people. I think they kind of the typical stance that I see is a lot of experimentation with native APIs, as Steen called them earlier, and a lot of thinking, well, but how does this translate to an actual integration in my world? And huge awareness of everything we talked about. I don't think I've met many people who aren't aware of these concerns.
Well, I did read a case study this morning about how some people are looking at the deployment of AI and Gen AI tools, in particular for knowledge workers, as similar to, the old school managers that said, I refuse to use email. I'm not going to use email. And we know people that were running very large companies whose admins would print out email because they refused to use the tool. Those are the decision makers who are also coming in and saying, oh, I have to have AI. So lack of awareness and willingness to try it universally, I think, is another big issue where you misunderstand what do you do it for. People like who you talk to, we do, to them, this is like another technology wave. Of course, you know how to integrate, you know what you need to do.
Yeah,
and certainly they are dealing with pressure from the executive ranks, so to speak, right? AI is big, find a way to deploy it. But I think, again, there is that fidelity within enterprises to correct against mistakes often.
Yeah, I
Now
still
we're going
think
to move on. I'm sorry, Steen. We're going to move on to the next topic. But before we leave, I wanted to give a plug to Sean Grimaldi, who is writing a series of articles. He just kicked it off last week on this very topic of security and adoption of generative AI on Tech Arena, and should be quite interesting for anybody who's listening online and is actually planning an enterprise deployment. Check that out. We're going to go under the hood a little bit. And you mentioned something, Lynn, about someone saying I need 500,000 GPUs. I was at the OCP conference a few weeks ago, and people were talking about nuclear reactors and all sorts of interesting things to get to that next data center moment in terms of compute capacity. Um, Enterprises probably aren't going to be buying nuclear power plants anytime soon. So, do we see the same infrastructure trends in enterprise as we've seen in this first wave of AI adoption and hyperscale, or is there another path emerging for adoption within enterprise, and what does that look like? We're starting with you, Lynn.
Boy, it's one of those hypothetical kind of things. I do see, I mean, on one hand, if AI pushes people to like legitimately workable, practical green energy solutions, hallelujah, that's awesome, right? Because it's not just AI that's making the power grid creaky and risky and, easily taken down. And I think we've seen that before AI ever came into it. In terms of what enterprises would have access to, I think it really depends on if you're talking about an enterprise that is trying to host these huge frontier models, because the advantage that Amazon and Microsoft and others have is they already have millions of cores deployed. They already had millions of GPUs deployed, or hundreds of thousands at least, because they were hosting different kinds of supercomputing workloads or HPC workloads. The question is really, do you want to have huge frontier models? Is there a driving factor for having that in the average enterprise? Or are you really looking at something that's more, a visual scanning or visual inspection or a visual decision-making situation at the edge, like if they're a trucking or logistics company, versus knowledge worker assistance, such as a Salesforce add-in? So I think it really does come down to, will the enterprises have a case for hosting huge, large supercomputing like installations, in which case you have to design for it? Or are they looking at this as something to augment their business process and their business flows?
Would you like to add something on this?
Yes, I would love to. I think this ties back to a previous comment about model sizes that will be deployed. So the current hype and trend, and beyond the hype, real deployments and real value that AI is creating within the especially hyperscaler space is rooted in real value that these companies can deliver, not just the availability of the infrastructure, but the real value they can deliver for their own internal businesses. Social media, Copilot for enterprise, etc. And for enterprises, one, they don't necessarily have the justification at that scale. They don't have the pockets at that scale, and they don't have the infrastructure to deliver, to deploy. It's not just a question of availability of power. It's availability of cooling to cool down the power if you deploy it to density, which goes back in my mind to deploying the right tool for the right task. Comes down to ultimately using open source trained models, and which are smaller in size, and then fine tuning them for your own business, which reduces some of the burden of the initial training that we mentioned earlier as a constraint, eliminates some of the other concerns that we've already talked about, and enables you to deploy within the available infrastructure for enterprise. Having said that, the risk within that landscape is that, if you buy into the AGI theology, that the capabilities of these huge models run away so quickly that eventually there's no sense in deploying smaller models, because you can never attain the value. I personally don't subscribe to that theology, and I think enterprises will still gain tremendous amount of value from deploying under more control with the right tools for the right tasks.
Yeah, I think that I think it's really helpful to just like, what is their core business? If you're Amazon or Microsoft, your core business is providing a bunch of infrastructure to host your business and then making it available to others to host theirs too. That isn't every enterprise's core business. So it's really like, to Ito's point, match what your business is to what you're actually developing and deploying.
Steen, when you're talking to customers, how would you make this pragmatic for them in terms of an approach?
Well, I think, I mean, Ito clarified kind of the industry standard approach, I would say, is, take a, off the shelf, pre-trained model with, open licensing terms and, take your proprietary, if you believe, what you do as a company is significant and, you have proprietary data and proprietary workflows. And I think the workflow piece is probably the more cutting edge piece. I'll talk a little bit about that, but, take your proprietary data and fine tune a model. Based on your data. And then, with the tools that we have around software defined prompting and retrieval augmented generation and, autonomous agents, now we can really drive, material top line value and productivity value as well. And so the most of the software engineering is happening in that later part. It's very easy to fine tune a model these days. And it's very affordable to fine tune a model these days, whether you're using traditional fine tuning or using one of the more novel techniques, which do have trade-offs than higher quality traditional fine tuning as well. So I think that's the approach. I think, unfortunately, I don't know how many people have the knowledge. There's asymmetric knowledge gap where, to Lynn's point, like the core competency of these companies, like you can see their core competency of the hyperscalers, but also there's so much asymmetric knowledge that they have in building out these AGI-esque models that they're doing, that I think they might get ambitious about how much they, penetrate into enterprise applications as well. So I think there's definitely a trade-off that happens there. And just to provide a real example to, the point we talk about, AGI versus fine tuning. For us, like a year ago, we could fine tune a model based on, medical text data, and it would outperform a state-of-the-art model. So that's something we could easily do. And, 72 hours of training, and we can outperform an off-the-shelf model. But you take like a Llama 405B, and now it's got so much information in it, it's harder for us to fine tune and outperform that. And so I think, this is where you definitely have to have something proprietary, unique data, because those open models do get fed with a ton of data. But now we get to talk about model deployment and just not training models. And so obviously 405B is going to take a million, if not multi-million-dollar server to run it. So, there's the reason to make it smaller, as well. So that still makes a great case for small fine-tuned models as well. But I think that software layer, the systematic software layer, is really the 10x for enterprises. And that's really where they should focus, and less so on fine-tuning the models. And the other thing I'd say is just the fine-tuning the embeddings model is, to Lynn's point about, making sure you're accessing high quality data, you have to fine tune the embeddings model to query the data accurately, in addition to the language model or whatever vision language model that you want to do as well. So that's another hidden gem is fine tuning the embeddings model as well.
Now I'm going to come back to you with my next question, Steen, which is one that we've been debating at Tech Arena quite a bit when we get together for our editorial meetings and other conversations about what's going on in tech. This deployment, is it likely to be centered in data centers or at the edge for enterprise? And what will drive that direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there's a generation of software developers, and IT employees, frankly, that are kind of cloud native today. And we went through a couple of decades of that transition, and that economies of scale. Meanwhile, there's CEOs like Hawk Tan that talk about the flip over half of the infrastructure going to go on-prem. I think there's a pretty material skills gap and appetite for that from kind of an implementation perspective that enterprises are going to have to address. And this is where I feel like there's a lot of risk for enterprise if they don't make it a high priority, to go on-prem, keep their data proprietary, care about the affordability of these solutions, their competitors may have all the same tools and services as them, and they might not look differentiated long-term in the market. But that's a lot of work, and I think it would be naive of me to say, and self-serving so, because we're really good at bare metal on-prem deployments across all modalities of CPUs and GPUs, which makes us quite unique. We'd love for that to happen, but I feel like there's a lot of momentum away from that the industry's put in place over the last couple of decades. And so I don't see a lot of people stepping up that don't have a strong view previously that they need to keep their infrastructure on-prem today. So I don't see that shifting back as fast as I would hope at this point in time.
What would you like to add?
I think we talked a little bit earlier about the sort of a dichotomy. I think Lynn talked about the ends in the middle, but there's a huge distinction in my mind between use cases that have very strong edge affinity, and those have lots of different characteristics about them. In terms of their diversity and uniqueness, if it's retail or manufacturing or all of these different things, and those will clearly be at the edge with, I think, near edge deployments of a lot of as well. And then that cloud versus on-prem thing is like, I don't know anymore. I hear companies talking about repatriation. I actually hear companies talking about AI being a driver for repatriation for concerns about data affinity of the proprietary data that we talked about earlier, concerns about compliance and security, et cetera. But we've heard these concerns about other workloads for such a long time. So I'm not sure that it's really a distinguishing dimension for AI. So hard to say.
Just a point of contention, if we want to have a debate, I think the one thing, having spent a lot of my career in edge AI deployments, I think one of the things that shocks me today is, it turns out the speed of light's really fast, and now you can use things like low orbit satellites. And the hyperscalers have all made huge investments in the proximity and availability of their services as well, such that the hassle of deploying physical infrastructure at the edge, I'm not sure it's worth the latency savings. Certainly not just for latency, but there's got to be some other elements, like data sovereignty or legal requirements for that data to be at the edge. And I'd like to say that it's an economics play. I just haven't seen a lot of companies doing the math on the affordability of that. It seems like it's just push the easy button, especially as the hyperscalers extend their services and do a great job managing their infrastructure. So that would be my debate against, what I spent 10 years of my career advocating for.
Yeah.
So for debates, sorry.
Oh, I was
So
just
go
say,
ahead,
I
Lynn.
just think that there's the other thing too, is it's like you say AI right now and everyone assumes you're thinking AGI or Gen AI. You say AI 5 years ago, people were thinking predictive analytics or machine learning or vision analytics. I suspect that there are companies who have those deployed for a very good reason: robotics lines, transport areas, supply chain logistics, things in that area. Do you count that as AI? It fits under the greater umbrella of it. So to Steen's point, if you're talking about Gen AI or AGI, that's one answer. And then if you're talking about some of these other more mature use cases, quite frankly, you probably will find some at the edge that are quite successful. They're just not going to be 500,000 GPU deployments, going back to the earlier number.
Well, I think there's another dimension that we haven't talked about. And that other dimension is that given the cost of and complexity, and therefore the concentration of these huge models, is this really the end of the technology? Is this really where AI and how AI gets deployed, or is there a more efficient way of accomplishing the same outcomes that's lurking in the halls of academia and will change our view of all of this in the next couple of years,
You threw that
right?
in at the very end of the debate, and I think that could make another second great debate. But we only have time for one more question, and it's this. What are your three keys for industry delivery in 2025, and will we deliver? Steen, we'll start with you.
I think number one is an industry. It's incredibly important to offer choice in the marketplace, and I think kind of any asymmetric outcomes for one company, you're probably not the best sustainably. So I like the industry to kind of offer choice across all factors from the infrastructure layer to the software layer, and making sure that there's a vibrant ecosystem of choice is going to be incredibly important, because that'll drive competition and ultimately new features and capabilities, and also affordability. So I think that's really important for the industry to deliver. Two, I think there's an emergent set of quality metrics that I think are incredibly important. I think all new, as far as Gen AI foundational models do come out with standard industry quality metrics. Unfortunately, a lot of that data can be in the training data set or in the wild, and there's been some ethical lapses in this space as well that are widely published. And so I think knowing the AI a bit better and making some major evolutions on knowing the AI. I mean, a lot of people liken it to brain surgery, and really understanding the human brain and as far as how these models work. But I think there needs to be a strong evolution of knowing the model, not just at the point of availability to the general audience, but also through the development phase to the production phase as well, because the models do drift over time as well. So I think really getting to know at least these tier one models. And I think the third thing that the industry needs to deliver, importantly for enterprises, is real tangible 10x like savings. And I think a lot of people, and I think rightly so, at least, have been touting, adoption of, certain, off the shelf AI applications as big wins. There was a company that came out recently that talked about one of their marquee customers, but if you did the math, it was like 3 queries a person of that tool. I don't think 3 queries a person is a win, looking back at even quarterly or annually. And so that's not certainly driving 10x material savings. So I think the industry's got to deliver some real, meaty savings that ultimately manifest in better products and better customer experiences. Otherwise, I think the hype will die down quite dramatically. So those would be the 3 things that I'd highlight.
Lynn, why don't you go next?
I think there's 2 that are kind of on the standard process, and one, to Ito's point, that I do wonder if there's a potential for outlier disruption. So the 2 that I would say, the agents, the use of AI agents within an enterprise environment with small language models. There's a lot of consultants who are specializing in being able to deploy that and improve that to an industry's workflows. So I think that's like more of a standard. Yeah, that will be going further and further. Frontier models will keep going. Enterprise AGI will keep going. And then I think one of the other things too is that knowledge workers are effectively going to, if you look at it at a really high level, they're going to be programmers. Prompt engineering is just the next iteration of people trying to figure out how to get a machine to do what you wanted it to do instead of what you actually programmed it to do. Prompt engineering is no different. I think everybody's going to have to figure that out. The one outlier that I keep asking myself is, Wi-Fi completely disrupted cellular business models. It was cheap, it was good enough, you could get it deployed in a lot of places. What is the easy button that's good enough not necessarily a benchmark winner, not necessarily the elite AGI use case, but is there some latent easy button that an enterprise person or an ISV or somebody who's developing some of these AI agents comes up with that's like, don't replace your infrastructure. You can do this, this, and that. Roll it out, and you got another year of hang time, and then you can make your decisions as this matures. So I think those are the three for me.
You know,
Those cover a lot of ground for me already. So to not repeat, I would modify. I don't think we necessarily need to see 10x's, but I think we need to see material proof points of enterprise value derived and the establishment of best known practices. I think that is what will really cause ultimately enterprise to change and enable enterprise to move forward. And I think it's dependent on all of these things that Steen and Lynn had already mentioned that I really don't feel like I must repeat.
thank you so much, everyone, for the scintillating discussion. One final question for you all. Where can folks find out more information about what technologies your company is delivering in this space and to follow you and connect with you further? Why don't you start?
So to connect me, the best way is LinkedIn. And to find out more about NeuReality and how we help enterprises and cloud service providers deploy AI, please go to NeuReality.ai.
And Lynn?
So to connect with me, LinkedIn and Tech Arena, because we do have a linkage there. Go through Tech Arena, they can find me and hunt me down. But then for Intel, there is an Intel AI landing page as well that will give you a guide and perspectives as well as some success stories enterprises have seen to date.
And Steen?
LinkedIn, X, Metrum AI, and I'm sure Tech Arena can hunt me down as well. So you can go through that avenue as well.
Fantastic. And of course, if you want to continue the dialogue with the broader industry on this topic and others related to AI, please give Tech Arena a follow or subscribe to our newsletter. These technologists and others are sharing their views every single week. Thanks so much for watching.